Hello, my name is Andrew Pilecki, and my presentation is entitled Delegitimization and the Moral Justification of Counterterrorism Policy, an analysis of post-9/11 political discourse in the United States. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, the U.S. embarked upon a war on terrorism that featured such things as preemptive wars against nations suspected of harboring terrorists, the use of enhanced interrogation techniques that are viewed by many as forms of torture, and the establishment of a prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to hold terrorism suspects indefinitely. These counterterrorism strategies, which clash with both domestic and international law, have been often justified in the name of U.S. and global security. For this presentation, I would like to show how these measures were justified through the construction of a delegitimized terrorist enemy figure that was portrayed as existing beyond boundaries of moral consideration. To understand this process, it is important to first examine how moral frameworks function within intergroup relations. Within social psychology, a number of theoretical frameworks have been proposed to explain why certain individuals are not afforded moral treatment. These share the assumption that a scope of justice exists that defines the boundaries of one's moral community. Simply put, those found within the scope of justice are perceived as deserving moral consideration, while those perceived as existing outside are perceived as undeserving of moral consideration. Moral disengagement theory proposes that through external pressure, individuals can disengage from the self-regulatory mechanisms that usually facilitate moral behavior. With the loss of these mechanisms, people no longer self-sanction their behavior. As such, actions that would normally be viewed as immoral can become viewed as morally irrelevant or morally justified. Expanding upon this theory, moral exclusion theory proposes that persons or groups can be viewed as existing outside the scope of justice. As a result, there is a decreased willingness to share resources with excluded groups, as well as a decreased willingness to make sacrifices to foster the well-being of those excluded. More importantly, moral exclusion theory states that standards of fairness are viewed as no longer applying to excluded groups, which in turn can facilitate harmful behavior. Lastly, delegitimization represents an especially extreme form of moral exclusion, in which the excluded group is described in extremely negative terms. For example, the group is compared to Nazis. Moreover, delegitimized groups are viewed as existing apart from the larger community of so-called acceptable groups, i.e., those groups who exist within the scope of justice. As a result, delegitimized groups are viewed as legitimate targets of violence. Although these theories differ to some degree, they share the common goal of explaining how doing this becomes morally acceptable. Nevertheless, these theories fail to capture the processes through which violence is construed as morally permissible or even a moral act in itself. To add to these theories, my colleagues and I are developing what we call a meta-ethical analytical approach to the study of intergroup relations. Often, whenever I introduce the meta-ethical analytical approach, I get two questions. What is it, and why meta-ethics and not just ethics? To answer question number one, meta-ethics is a subdiscipline of ethics concerned with the nature of moral judgment. Meta-ethics is concerned with three questions. What do terms like right, wrong, and good mean? What makes judgment a moral judgment? And do moral judgments refer to universal truths? To answer question number two, the question of why we advocate a meta-ethical approach is that it recognizes that moral judgment does not occur in a vacuum. Rather, I'm trying to draw attention to the beliefs and assumptions that underlie moral judgment in order to provide a method for deconstructing moral discourse. A meta-ethical analytical approach deconstructs moral discourse by posing the following series of questions. How is the scope of justice defined? Namely, what moral values are considered essentially human and universal? How are groups differentiated along a moral basis? To what extent are intergroup relations viewed through a moral lens? How is membership in moral communities determined? And finally, in addressing these questions, how do we come to understand how doing violence becomes viewed as a moral act in itself? The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate the utility of this approach by examining how both the Bush and Obama administrations have constructed and maintained a morally abject, delegitimized terrorist enemy figure. For the study, we reviewed speeches by Presidents Bush and Obama that feature terrorism. Moreover, we employed a critical discourse analytical framework to analyze speeches. Thus, we aim to denaturalize and deconstruct the moral content that emerged in these speeches in order to isolate the meta-ethical claims made by both Bush and Obama with respect to terrorism. Our analysis of President Bush's speeches revealed the construction of a delegitimized terrorist figure based on the claim that terrorists represented an inherent threat to freedom. Within Bush's rhetoric, freedom is defined as a universal human moral value. The terrorist, in turn, is positioned as the antithesis of this basic moral value and the larger freedom-loving moral community. Bush never articulates the specific reasons why terrorists are opposed to this basic moral value. This serves the purpose of depoliticizing terrorist violence and any political grievances they may have. Rather, terrorists are defined as bloodthirsty murderers who represent an inherent threat to innocent people. From these meta-ethical claims, a delegitimized terrorist figure is constructed. To construct freedom as a universal moral value, President Bush describes freedom as a God-given cause shared by all of humanity. Thus he states, "The cause we serve is right, because it is the cause of all mankind." Moreover, Bush states, "I believe that God has planted in every human heart the desire to live in freedom." Terrorists, in turn, fear this God-given moral right. Freedom is thus constructed as an antidote to terrorism. Actions that promote terrorism constrain terrorists and decrease the threat they pose. Thus Bush states, "What every terrorist fears most is human freedom. Free people are not drawn to violent and malignant ideologies, and most will choose a better way when they're given a chance." Juxtaposed against freedom-loving people, terrorists are described as simply those who embrace murder, death, and tyranny. Such a depiction emphasizes the threat terrorists pose to the larger global community, as well as depoliticize the violence that they inflict. Thus Bush states, "Our enemies send other people's children on missions of suicide and murder. They embrace tyranny and death as a cause and a creed." As a result of these claims, counterterrorism efforts become a moral issue, namely, as a battle of good versus evil, in which there can be no compromise. As such, the terrorist is delegitimized as an inherent threat to the basic moral values that must be eliminated by any means necessary. As President Bush stated in his farewell address, "I've often spoken to you about good and evil, and this has made some uncomfortable. But good and evil are present in this world, and between the two of them there can be no compromise. Murdering the innocent to advance an ideology is wrong every time, everywhere. Freeing people from oppression and despair is eternally right." Nevertheless, shortly after President Obama's inauguration, attempts were made to place the terrorist enemy within the scope of justice and place counterterrorism within a legal framework. Thus Obama states, "Because living our values doesn't make us weaker, it makes us safer and it makes us stronger. And that is why I can stand here tonight and say without exception or equivocation that the United States of America does not torture." Thus, President Obama made numerous declarations saying that the United States does not and will not use torture in its fight against terrorism. Also, President Obama made sure to distance himself from the actions undertaken by the previous administration. Thus, President Obama declared that the United States would abide by the rule of law and that counterterrorism efforts would be reflective of U.S. values and institutions. As we know, the prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba remains open. Thus, President Obama's efforts in this regard remain unfulfilled. Nevertheless, President Obama stated, "From Europe to the Pacific, we've been the nation that has shut down torture chambers and replaced the tyranny with the rule of law. That is who we are, and where terrorists offer only the injustice of disorder and destruction, America must demonstrate that our values and our institutions are more resilient than a hateful ideology." Why did President Obama's initial efforts fail ultimately? Our analysis revealed that despite President Obama's initial efforts to bring the terrorist enemy within the scope of justice, he retained in many ways the delegitimizing rhetoric used by his predecessor. Thus, President Obama states, "As we know, these men belong to Al-Qaeda, a group of extremists who have distorted and defiled Islam, one of the world's great religions. to justify the slaughter of innocents. We're in Afghanistan to prevent a cancer from once again spreading through that country. Thus, President Obama attempted the difficult task of integrating terrorists within the scope of justice, while at the same time describing terrorists in delegitimizing terms. For example, as extremists who defile Islam, slaughter innocent people, and represent a cancer upon societies. Beyond retaining some of the rhetoric of the previous administration, our analysis revealed that President Obama constructed a delegitimized terrorist enemy figure based on the claim that terrorists threatened universal standards of justice. Within this frame, justice is defined in terms of basic human rights that terrorists ultimately threaten. As Bush did with the moral value of freedom, Obama established justice as a fundamental moral value, the antithesis of which is the terrorist figure. As such, the terrorist is portrayed as that which must be brought to justice, and as President Obama's remarks following the death of Osama bin Laden show, justice is equated with the death of the terrorist enemy. From these meta-ethical claims, a different delegitimized terrorist enemy is constructed. For President Obama, justice is defined in terms of rights that are defined as universal. Unlike President Bush's ambiguously defined freedom, Obama defines these rights in accordance with traditional Western liberal concepts like freedom of speech and the rule of law. Thus, Obama states, "We support a set of universal rights. Those rights include free speech, the freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of religion, equality for men and women under the rule of law, and the right to choose your own leaders." The terrorist is juxtaposed against these universal rights. As shown in this excerpt, terrorist violence is framed as the antithesis of rights defined as essentially human. Thus, Obama states, "We will support efforts by the Afghan government to open the door to those Taliban who abandon violence and respect the human rights of their fellow citizens." Moreover, like Bush, terrorist violence is depoliticized. Whereas the moral community of the U.S. and its allies stand for justice and progress, the terrorist enemy is framed as believing in nothing but a bankrupt vision of misery and death. As such, the terrorist is delegitimized as it is placed outside of the moral community that adhere to basic and human standards of justice, and depicted as that which brings only death and destruction. Thus, Obama states, "And that's why we must communicate clearly to Muslims around the world that Al-Qaeda offers nothing except a bankrupt vision of misery and death, including the murder of fellow Muslims, while the United States stands with those who seek justice and progress." Like President Bush, President Obama also frames counterterrorism as a moral issue. Following the death of Osama bin Laden, President Obama depicts his killing as a form of justice. President Obama goes so far as to say that those who value peace and human dignity ought to welcome the demise of Osama bin Laden. Within these terms, counterterrorism violence becomes a moral act. For example, Obama states, "We will be true to the values that make us who we are. And on nights like this one, we can say to those families who have lost loved ones to Al-Qaeda's terror, justice has been done." Obama goes on to say, "Bin Laden was a mass murderer of Muslims. His demise should be welcomed by all who believe in peace and human dignity." In conclusion, by employing a meta-ethical analytical approach, our analysis revealed that both Presidents Bush and Obama constructed a delegitimized terrorist enemy figure towards which extreme counterterrorism measures could be justified. Bush and Obama emphasized different moral values in their delegitimizing rhetoric. For Bush, the terrorist was an enemy of freedom, while for Obama, the terrorist was a threat to universal standards of justice. Ultimately, through the construction of a delegitimized terrorist figure, counterterrorism was framed as a moral imperative. Namely, for Bush, counterterrorism stood as a battle between good and evil, while for Obama, counterterrorism became a means of delivering righteous justice. Lastly, our analysis reveals the power of moral discourse. Namely, Obama's difficulty in bringing the terrorists back into the scope of justice was due in part to his continued use of delegitimizing rhetoric when discussing terrorism. Thus, our study illustrates the fundamental issue facing those interested in preserving the rule of law and human rights with respect to counterterrorism. Namely, how does one treat justly that which is perceived as inherently evil? This concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at andrewpilecki or apilecki@ucsc.edu. And if you want more information on my research, please visit www.moralcommunities.com. Thank you.